I've always known my family had a favorite, and it wasn't me. I'm 25 now, but this has been clear for as long as I can remember. My older sister, Lisa, has always been the center of everything. She's 2 years older, prettier, more outgoing, and, let's face it, way better at getting people to bend over backward for her. I'm not saying I resent her for it. Well, okay, maybe I do a little. But it's my parents who really made it unbearable. When Lisa went to college, my parents treated her like a queen. They paid her tuition, gave her a monthly allowance, and even covered the rent for her off-campus apartment. Meanwhile, I was still in high school, getting lectures about learning the value of hard work every time I asked for gas money. I figured they were just waiting for me to reach college age to get the same treatment, but nope. When my time came, I got a pat on the back and a reminder to apply for student loans. "You're smart, Adam," my dad said, like that was supposed to make me feel better. "You'll figure it out." I worked 3 part-time jobs, barely slept, and racked up debt just to make it through school. And while I was doing that, Lisa decided to drop out during her last semester. Her reason? She wanted to focus on her band. That's right, her band. Some garage group she'd thrown together with a few friends who were more interested in drinking beer than writing songs. My parents didn't even try to talk her out of it. Instead, they told her to follow her passion and do what makes her happy. If I tried to pull something like that, they would have laughed in my face. Of course, the whole band thing fell apart within a few months. They replaced Lisa with someone who actually knew how to edit music, and she came crawling back home with no degree, no job, and no plan. Did my parents tell her to get it together? Nope. They let her move back in rent-free and started covering all her expenses again, like nothing had happened. I'd visit and find her sitting on the couch watching reality TV or scrolling through Instagram while my mom cooked her lunch. She didn't even pretend to be looking for a job. Meanwhile, I was barely scraping by. I graduated last year and landed an entry-level job that paid enough to cover my rent and not much else. My parents didn't show up to my graduation, by the way. They said they were too busy, which was laughable because I found out later they'd been planning a surprise party for Lisa. It wasn't her birthday or anything. They just wanted to cheer her up after her latest breakup. That was the moment I realized I was done hoping they'd change. I'd spent years trying to earn their approval, thinking maybe if I worked hard enough or achieved enough, they'd finally see me the way they saw Lisa. But they never would. No matter what I did, Lisa would always come first. Still, I thought maybe I could at least keep things civil. A few months ago, I invited them to my housewarming party. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small get-together to celebrate moving into my first real apartment. I thought they'd at least show up for an hour or two. Instead, they called the morning of to say they couldn't make it. Something came up with Lisa, my mom said vaguely. Later, I found out they'd driven 3 hours to help her pick out furniture for her new room. She decided to redecorate after getting into a fight with her roommate. I couldn't stop thinking about that as I cleaned up after the party. They'd driven 3 hours for her, but couldn't bother to drive 20 minutes for me. It was so ridiculous, I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I sat down and stared at my phone, wondering if I should even bother calling them out on it. I knew how it would go. They'd act like I was overreacting, like I should be grateful for what little attention they gave me. But something in me snapped. The next day, I called my dad. I kept it short. "I'm tired of being treated like I don't matter," I said. "If you can't show up for me the way you do for Lisa, then don't bother pretending we're a family." He didn't take it well. He accused me of being ungrateful, saying I didn't understand how hard they'd worked to give me opportunities. I hung up before he could finish. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty about it. I was just done. After that phone call with my dad, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, relief, and, if I'm honest, a little sadness. It wasn't easy to cut ties, even temporarily, but it felt necessary. I told myself that if they cared enough to reflect on what I'd said, maybe things could change. Deep down, though, I didn't hold my breath. For a few weeks, things were quiet. I focused on my job, my apartment, and trying to make a life that didn't revolve around my family's drama. Then, out of nowhere, my grandparents called. They don't usually get involved in the mess between me, my parents, and Lisa, but this time, they wanted to talk. Apparently, my dad had called them after our argument, claiming I'd disrespected him and blown things out of proportion. My grandparents wanted to hear my side of the story. At first, I hesitated. My grandparents are wonderful people, but I didn't want to drag them into the chaos. Still, when my grandfather gently said, "We've always been proud of you, Adam. We just want to understand," I broke down. I told them everything. How I'd always felt overlooked. How my parents had funded Lisa's every whim while I struggled to get by. How they skipped my graduation for a party Lisa didn't even deserve. By the time I finished, my voice was shaking. It felt like years of pent-up frustration pouring out all at once. My grandmother was quiet for a moment before she said, "That's not right. That's not how family should treat you." Her voice was steady but laced with anger, which was rare for her. My grandfather, meanwhile, didn't hold back. He called my parents' behavior shameful and said it was time they faced the consequences of their favoritism. I didn't expect what happened next. That same evening, my grandparents showed up at my parents' house unannounced. They confronted them about everything. How they'd neglected me, how they'd enabled Lisa's laziness, and how they'd let her failures become everyone else's problem. I wasn't there to witness it, but according to my grandparents, it was explosive. My dad tried to defend himself, saying I was too independent to need help, and that Lisa had always been more sensitive. My grandparents didn't buy it. My grandfather apparently told them, "Being independent doesn't mean you should be ignored. Adam's not some robot who doesn't need support." The fallout from that confrontation was immediate. My dad called me the next morning, furious. He accused me of turning the family against him and ruining their relationship with my grandparents. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he shouted. "They're cutting us off, Adam. No more money, no more help with the house. Nothing. All because you couldn't let things go." I stayed calm, even though my heart was pounding. "I didn't make them do anything," I said. "Maybe they're just tired of you treating me like I don't matter." That only made him angrier. He started ranting about how I was selfish and how Lisa was struggling enough, without me, causing more problems. That's when I snapped. "Struggling?" I said, my voice finally rising. "She's been struggling for years because you let her. You've done everything for her and nothing for me, and you expect me to fix it? I'm not your scapegoat, Dad." He hung up on me, and for the first time, I didn't feel the usual pang of guilt. I felt free. Over the next few days, Lisa joined the fray. She started texting me long paragraphs about how I was being cruel to our parents and how I needed to think about what this is doing to the family. I didn't respond. Then she took it to social media, which was honestly her go-to move. She posted vague status updates about toxic family members and how some people will do anything for attention. It didn't take a genius to figure out she was talking about me. A few mutual friends reached out, asking what was going on. I gave them the short version, not wanting to drag them into it, but it was frustrating to see Lisa spinning the narrative in her favor. She's always been good at making herself look like the victim, and it was exhausting watching her do it again. My grandparents, meanwhile, were firmly on my side. They called me almost daily to check in and make sure I was okay. My grandfather even joked, "If Lisa posts one more thing, maybe I'll get a Facebook account just to comment the truth." I laughed for the first time in weeks, and it reminded me that I wasn't as alone in this as I sometimes felt. But the best thing my grandparents did was take action. They called me one evening and said they wanted to help me pay off some of my student loans. At first, I hesitated. I'd spent so long trying to handle everything on my own that accepting help felt strange, almost like admitting defeat. My grandmother quickly put that thought to rest. "It's not about you needing help," she said. "It's about us wanting to do something for someone who deserves it." So I accepted, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I wasn't drowning in debt anymore, and I could finally start saving for the future. Meanwhile, my parents were left to deal with the consequences of their own choices. It wasn't my problem anymore. After accepting my grandparents' help, life started to feel a little lighter. It wasn't just about the financial relief, though that was a huge weight off my shoulders. It was the realization that I had people in my corner. For so long, I'd felt like I was fighting this uphill battle alone, but now I had support from two people who genuinely cared about me. It gave me a sense of stability I hadn't felt in years. Of course, My parents and Lisa didn't take kindly to the new dynamic. They must have realized my grandparents were serious about cutting them off because the calls and messages from my mom and dad became more desperate. My mom even left a voicemail at one point, crying and saying that I was tearing the family apart by refusing to make amends. My dad's tone was more aggressive, accusing me of turning my grandparents against them and demanding that I fix this mess. I ignored them both. It was exhausting, but I wasn't going to give in. Lisa, however, took things to another level. Since her vague social media posts weren't getting enough attention, she started directly calling me out online. She wrote this long, dramatic post about how I'd poisoned our grandparents against her and ruined her chances of getting her life back on track. She even had the audacity to claim that I was hoarding the family's resources for myself, like I was some kind of greedy villain in a bad movie. The comments poured in from her friends, many of whom I hadn't seen or spoken to in years. Some of them believed her, posting things like, "Stay strong, Lisa," or "Family can be so cruel sometimes." A few mutual friends reached out to me privately, asking if what she said was true. I didn't want to drag them into the drama, but I also wasn't going to let Lisa's lies go unchecked. I explained my side of the story in the simplest terms. My grandparents decided to stop enabling her, and now she's angry. That's all there is to it. Most of them seemed to understand, but it was still frustrating to see Lisa playing the victim so convincingly. My grandparents, as always, had my back. When I told them about Lisa's latest antics, my grandfather let out this long sigh and said, "It's time she grows up. She can't keep blaming everyone else for her problems." My grandmother was less forgiving. "If she keeps this up," she said, "maybe we should set the record straight ourselves." The idea of my sweet, mild-mannered grandmother wading into a social media fight was almost enough to make me laugh. Almost. But despite their support, the situation was wearing on me. I hated how public Lisa was making everything, turning our family's dysfunction into a spectacle for all to see. It was humiliating, even if I knew I wasn't the one in the wrong. I decided to do something I'd never done before. I blocked Lisa on every platform. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, gone. I even blocked her number. It felt drastic, but I couldn't keep letting her nonsense invade my life. That decision turned out to be one of the best things I'd ever done. Without Lisa's constant posts and messages, I finally had the space to focus on myself. I threw myself into work, picking up extra projects and impressing my manager enough to get a small promotion. I started going to the gym again, something I'd let slide during the chaos of the past few months. I even reconnected with an old friend from college, which was a reminder that not every relationship in my life was as toxic as the one I had with my family. For a while, things were quiet. Too quiet. I knew my parents and Lisa weren't just going to let this go, but I didn't know what their next move would be. Then, one day, I got an email from my dad. It was short and to the point. No dramatics, no guilt tripping. He wrote that he and my mom wanted to meet me for lunch to discuss the family situation. That was it. I stared at the email for a long time, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to delete it and pretend I hadn't seen it. Another part of me was curious. Did they actually want to have a real conversation? Or was this just another attempt to pull me back into their orbit? After talking it over with my grandparents, I decided to go. I didn't expect much, but I figured I'd at least hear them out. The lunch was about as awkward as I'd imagined. My parents were already seated when I arrived, and the tension was palpable. My mom smiled nervously as I sat down, while my dad immediately launched into how they were concerned about how things had escalated. He tried to frame the whole situation as a misunderstanding, as if years of favoritism and neglect could be chalked up to a simple communication issue. I let them talk for a while before cutting in. "Do you even realize why I'm upset?" I asked. My dad looked annoyed, like the question itself was unreasonable. My mom started to say something, but I held up a hand to stop her. "I'm not here to play nice and pretend everything's fine. If you can't take accountability for how you've treated me, then this conversation is pointless." My dad scoffed and muttered something about me being dramatic. But my mom started crying. She said she didn't know how to fix things, and that it hurt her to see the family so divided. I told her the only way to fix things was for them to stop enabling Lisa and start treating me like I mattered. "It's not about Lisa," she said through tears. It's about all of us. That was my cue to leave. I stood up, thanked them for lunch, and told them I wasn't ready to reconcile. If you ever decide to take responsibility, I said, you know where to find me. Then I walked out, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. I didn't hear from them again for a while after that. And honestly, I didn't mind. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living in their shadow or letting their chaos define me. I was finally free to focus on myself, and that was more than enough. A few weeks passed after the lunch with my parents, and I found myself thinking about it less and less. I didn't feel guilt or regret for how it ended, which was a new feeling for me. In the past, I'd always been the one to second-guess myself, wondering if I should have said or done something differently. But this time, I was at peace with walking away. If they wanted to fix things, the ball was in their court. Meanwhile, Lisa was still causing ripples. I hadn't seen her post since I'd blocked her, but mutual friends occasionally brought her up in conversation. Apparently, she'd started doubling down on the family betrayal narrative, adding new layers of drama every week. One friend even sent me a screenshot of a post where Lisa claimed I'd brainwashed our grandparents into abandoning her. It was ridiculous, but it still got under my skin. I hated how she kept twisting the truth to make herself look like the victim. One evening, my grandparents invited me over for dinner. I was happy to go. It was always comforting to spend time with them. My grandfather was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of stew, while my grandmother set the table. The house smelled like rosemary and garlic, and for the first time that day, I felt like I could relax. Halfway through dinner, the topic of Lisa came up. My grandmother mentioned that Lisa had reached out to them again, asking for money. She said she needed help paying for therapy, my grandmother said, her voice heavy with skepticism. But when we asked her for details, like the name of her therapist, she got defensive and wouldn't answer. My grandfather shook his head, muttering something under his breath about how Lisa was always looking for an easy way out. I sighed. She's never going to change, is she? I asked, mostly to myself. My grandmother reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. People don't change unless they want to, Adam, she said gently. And Lisa, well, she doesn't seem to want to. Hearing her say that felt like validation. For so long, I'd wondered if I was being too harsh on Lisa, too unforgiving. But the truth was, she'd never given me a reason to believe she was capable of taking responsibility for her actions. She was stuck in this cycle of blaming everyone else for her problems, and I wasn't going to let myself get dragged into it anymore. As the weeks went on, I threw myself into my work and started focusing on things that made me happy. I'd been promoted to a slightly higher position at my job, and while it wasn't a huge leap, it felt like a step in the right direction. I also started taking guitar lessons again, something I hadn't done since high school. It felt good to reconnect with a part of myself I'd almost forgotten about. One afternoon, I got a text from a mutual friend, someone who'd known both Lisa and me since high school. Hey, she wrote, have you seen Lisa's latest post? You might want to check it out. I rolled my eyes. I'd blocked Lisa on every platform, so whatever drama she was stirring up didn't reach me anymore. I don't follow her anymore, I replied. What's it about? The friend hesitated for a moment before replying. She's saying some pretty nasty stuff about you. Just thought you should know. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. Using a friend's account, I checked Lisa's page. There it was, a long, dramatic post about how I'd cut ties with the family and was brainwashing our grandparents to take my side. She painted me as a greedy, manipulative villain who'd turned everyone against her out of jealousy. The comments were full of sympathy for her, people saying things like, "You don't deserve this, Lisa," and "Stay strong." I felt my stomach tighten as I scrolled through the comments. It wasn't that I cared what her followers thought of me. They didn't know me, and their opinions meant nothing. What bothered me was the way Lisa kept rewriting history to suit her narrative. It was like she couldn't stand the idea of people seeing her for who she really was, so she had to make me the villain to maintain her image. For a moment, I considered responding, setting the record straight. But then I stopped myself. What would that accomplish? Lisa thrived on attention, and engaging with her would only give her more fuel. I closed the app and put my phone down, deciding it wasn't worth my energy. Instead, I focused on what I could control. I started spending more time with friends, rebuilding relationships I'd neglected during college, and the years I spent trying to hold my family together. I even started dating again, something I'd avoided for a long time because I felt like my life was too chaotic to bring someone else into it. Slowly but surely, I was building a life that felt stable and fulfilling, one step at a time. My parents were still silent, which was both a relief and a little unsettling. I knew them well enough to know they weren't just letting things go. They were probably waiting for the right moment to jump back into the picture. Sure enough, about a month after the lunch, my mom emailed me again. Her tone was softer this time, almost pleading. "I just want our family to be whole again," she wrote. "Can we please talk?" I didn't reply. I wasn't ready to open that door again, not when I knew it would lead to the same cycle of guilt and manipulation. My grandparents supported my decision, reminding me that it was okay to protect my peace. "You've spent your whole life putting other people first," my grandfather said. "Now it's your turn to focus on yourself." For once, I was finally doing just that, and it felt damn good. A few months went by, and I started to feel like I was finally getting my life on track. My job was steady, my weekends were spent with friends or working on hobbies, and I was even starting to think about taking a trip, something I hadn't done in years. It was strange, but also freeing, to not feel tethered to my family's constant drama. For the first time, my life was about me, and not about cleaning up someone else's mess. But, as expected, that peace didn't last long. My mom decided to escalate her efforts to fix the family by showing up unannounced at my apartment one Saturday morning. I opened the door, still in my pajamas, to see her standing there with a Tupperware container of cookies, like she was trying to soften the blow of whatever guilt trip she had planned. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, her voice overly sweet, like she thought this was a normal visit. "I thought we could talk." I didn't invite her in. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. "What do you want, Mom?" I asked, keeping my voice as calm as possible. She looked taken aback, like she hadn't expected me to be so blunt. I miss you, Adam," she said. "It hurts me that we're so distant. I just want to understand why." I almost laughed. After everything, she still didn't get it. Or maybe she just didn't want to. "You know why," I said, crossing my arms. "You've always treated Lisa like she's the only one who matters, and every time I try to talk to you about it, you brush me off or make excuses." "That's not fair," she said quickly, her voice shaking a little. "We've always loved you. It's just, Lisa needs more support. She's been through so much." I shook my head. "She's been through so much because you've enabled her to fail over and over again. And while you were busy picking up her pieces, I was left to fend for myself. Do you have any idea how exhausting that's been?" My mom's eyes filled with tears, but instead of apologizing, she said, "We were just trying to do the best we could. Nobody's perfect, Adam." I felt a flash of anger, but kept it in check. "I'm not asking you to be perfect," I said. "I'm asking you to take responsibility. That's it. And if you can't do that, then we have nothing to talk about." She sniffled and looked down at the cookies she was holding, like she'd forgotten why she'd brought them. "I just want us to be a family again," she said softly. "We've never been a family, Mom," I said, my voice quieter now. "Not really. Not in the way you think. And that's not on me to fix." For a moment, she looked like she was going to argue, but then she sighed and nodded. "I'm sorry," she said, but it didn't sound sincere. It sounded like she was saying it because she didn't know what else to do. She handed me the cookies, and I accepted them, more out of politeness than anything else. Then she left, and I went back inside, my head spinning. That encounter stuck with me for days. Part of me felt bad. No matter how strained our relationship was, it was hard to see my mom so upset. But the larger part of me knew I was doing the right thing by holding my ground. I'd spent too much of my life compromising for the sake of keeping the peace, and I wasn't going to do it anymore. Meanwhile, Lisa was still doing what Lisa does best, causing chaos. She'd apparently started telling mutual friends that I'd kicked Mom out when she came to visit, which wasn't remotely true. A friend called me to ask about it, and when I explained what actually happened, she said, "That sounds more like the Lisa I know." It was a small comfort to know that not everyone was buying into her theatrics. My grandparents remained my rock through all of this. They'd heard about my mom's visit and were furious on my behalf. "She's lucky I wasn't there," my grandfather said gruffly. "I'd have told her to take those cookies and—" "Bill," my grandmother interrupted, trying not to laugh. "That's enough." It was moments like that that reminded me how lucky I was to have them. They didn't just support me, they validated me. They made me feel seen in a way my parents never had. And they reminded me that it was okay to set boundaries, even if it made other people uncomfortable. As the weeks went on, I started to notice a shift in myself. I was no longer waiting for the next wave of drama to hit. Instead, I was focused on my own goals, my own happiness. I started saving for that trip I'd been thinking about, a solo trip to Europe, something I'd always wanted to do but had never felt brave enough to pursue. Now, I wasn't just brave enough, I was excited. My parents and Lisa? They were still out there, somewhere in the background of my life, but their influence over me was fading. And for the first time, I felt like I was finally free. A few more months passed, and the distance between me and my family grew quieter, like a storm that had finally blown over. My parents stopped trying to reach out as much, and Lisa's social media antics seemed to slow down. Whether it was because they'd finally accepted my boundaries or just gotten bored, I didn't know, and honestly, I didn't care. I had my life, and it was mine in a way it hadn't been for years. By the time the holidays rolled around, I knew I wasn't going to spend them with my parents. The idea of sitting around a table with them, pretending everything was fine while Lisa basked in her usual spotlight, made my stomach turn. So, when my grandparents invited me to spend Christmas at their place, I didn't hesitate to accept. Their house felt like a sanctuary that year. My grandmother had gone all out with the decorations, twinkling lights, a perfectly trimmed tree, and the smell of freshly baked cookies wafting through the air. My grandfather had even put on an old Santa hat, grumbling about how ridiculous it looked while secretly loving every second of it. It was simple, peaceful, and exactly what I needed. On Christmas Eve, after dinner, my grandfather poured us each a glass of wine, and we sat by the fire talking. He asked me how I'd been feeling about everything. My parents, Lisa, the decisions I'd made to distance myself. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure how to put it into words. But then I said, I feel free. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm living for myself instead of for them. He nodded slowly, swirling the wine in his glass. That's all we ever wanted for you, he said. To find your own happiness, even if it means walking away from people who can't see your worth. Hearing him say that solidified something in me. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and I'd fought hard to get here. The next morning, we opened presents and spent the day cooking a big Christmas dinner. It was small, just the three of us, but it felt more like family than any holiday I'd had growing up. At one point, my grandmother hugged me tightly and said, "You deserve this, Adam. Don't ever forget that." After the holidays, I went back to my routine. Work was going well, and I'd officially booked my trip to Europe, a 2-week adventure I'd been dreaming about for years. I spent my free time planning itineraries, researching places to visit, and brushing up on basic French and Italian phrases. Every step of the process felt like a celebration of the life I was building for myself. Then, out of the blue, my dad emailed me again. This time, the tone was different. He wasn't angry or defensive. He wrote that he'd been thinking a lot about what I'd said during our last conversation and that he wanted to apologize. He admitted that he and my mom had been unfair to me over the years and that they'd let Lisa's struggles blind them to what I needed. It wasn't perfect. It felt a little surface level, like he was testing the waters rather than diving into full accountability, but it was more than I'd ever gotten from him before. I didn't reply right away. I read the email over and over, trying to decide what I felt about it. Part of me wanted to believe it was sincere, but another part couldn't forget how many times they'd brushed off my feelings in the past. In the end, I decided to wait and see if their actions matched their words. In the weeks that followed, my parents didn't push. They didn't call or send follow-ups, which was a relief. For once, it felt like they were giving me the space I'd always asked for. Lisa, on the other hand, was still quiet. I had no idea what she was up to, and I wasn't particularly interested in finding out. Whatever chaos she was stirring up, it wasn't my responsibility to fix anymore. As the date for my trip approached, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. I'd never traveled alone before, but that was part of the appeal. This trip wasn't about anyone else. It was just for me. The night before I left, my grandparents called to wish me a safe journey. "Take lots of pictures," my grandmother said. "And remember, we're so proud of you." That night, as I packed my bag, I thought about how far I'd come. A year ago, I was drowning in debt, guilt, and the weight of trying to earn my family's approval. Now, I was standing on my own 2 feet, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me, and looking forward to a future that felt bright and open with possibilities. I didn't know what would happen with my parents or Lisa in the long run. Maybe they'd change, maybe they wouldn't, but I wasn't holding my breath or waiting for them to catch up. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing after anyone's approval. I was enough, just as I was. As I zipped up my suitcase, I smiled to myself. Tomorrow, I'd be stepping onto a plane and into a new chapter of my life. And for the first time, it felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be.